live. I'm waiting. It's connecting to streaming. Welcome to the Red Mic podcast. Today we have a Central Committee member, Comrade Rob Davies, who's also the Politburo member, who's going to give us an analysis on the recently adopted budget that was done just this Thursday that we are coming from. He'll give us the events regarding the fiscal framework towards the adoption of the budget this last week. Welcome, Comrade Rob Davies.
Thank you.
Just as I introduced the topic, could you kindly just give us an analysis of the budget developments from the adopted budget presentation and the abandoned one from February until the one that we have here, and if possibly, can you give us just a critique and alternatives that government could have adopted?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all I should just say that the budget in its totality was not actually passed on Thursday. What was passed on Thursday was the fiscal framework. There's still a number of other steps before the budget is completed, including the votes of individual national departments, the Division of Revenue, and also the appropriation bill. All of those things still have to be passed, and that won't happen for some weeks. But the point I think is that we have seen over the last 5 or 6 years, even going further back, we have seen that there has been what we call austerity budgeting. And I think it's important that we have to be clear about what we mean by austerity budgeting. And what we mean by austerity is not that we are in favor of wasting money, or that there should be lots of perks for government ministers and whatever, or that there shouldn't be an attempt to try to get more value for money. We support all of those things: cutting perks, getting better value for money, fighting corruption, all of that. But I think the importance of neoliberal austerity is that it has a series of ratios which are particularly important to neoliberal financial market players. They include the debt to GDP ratio, which they say should never be more than 60%, that your budget deficit should be less than 3% and declining, that you should have what they call a primary surplus, which means that you are getting in more revenue than you are spending on current expenditure minus debt repayments. And so those ratios have been held to be absolutely important, and that they must prioritize everything else. So it doesn't matter what the state of the economy is, it doesn't matter what important demands there are of people for government services, these ratios must be the most important consideration. And what's happened is, as our economy has been relatively depressed, and as it went into a fairly heavy recession during COVID, is the economy has not generated as much revenue. And so what's happened all the time is that there's been cuts. And it's reached the point where there was practically no service that wasn't cut. And also that the continued contraction of public expenditure, including infrastructure expenditure and other things, has had a depressing effect on the economy, and it itself has contributed to the languid performance of the economy. And I think it reached a point where things like education, things like health, which was no longer going to receive funding from the US PEPFAR for the HIV/AIDS program and things like that, was so unpalatable, couldn't carry on like that, that the government decided this time that there needed to be some tapering off in the pace of contraction. And so there was a real increase in spending for those two portfolios, not for everything, not to the extent that we think it should have been, not to the extent that it's going to have a positive impact on the economy, but in order to meet the fiscal ratios and some of the fiscal anchor rules that they had put in, what they said this time around was they need to raise more revenue. And they went for value-added tax. Now, they did add to the list of zero-rated items, but when we looked at the figures and when we asked people that we trust who do these analysis, they told us there's no way that the increase in the number of zero-rated items was going to compensate for poor people and working-class people for the additional cost-raising effect of a 2% increase in VAT. Now, there was a big outcry, mostly among, I would say, the political scene rather than among the ordinary people at this point about this increased VAT. It didn't just come from the left and progressive forces. We also had the DA and the right climbing in as well and saying they wouldn't support a VAT increase. I think what people don't notice about that is that the DA's alternative is much more stringent austerity. They have expressed themselves as being admirers of Javier Milei, who is the president of Argentina, whose sort of hallmark is standing there with a chainsaw and saying he's going to take a chainsaw to government. Drastic cuts to government services, and also taken over in this thing called Doge in the United States, where in the name of promoting government efficiency, people like Elon Musk are actually implementing large cuts in public services so that they can allow Trump to make a cut in taxes for the ultra-rich. That's the route of travel, the direction of travel that the DA wanted to go down. But because they were opposing that, it seemed like they were standing up for the people. And so we had this impasse between these partners in this coalition government. They didn't agree, and when the budget was first supposed to be tabled, it was not tabled because there was this disagreement held it back. So it was postponed, and eventually they agreed that there would be a presentation of the budget, and then afterwards they would have a lot of discussions in the parliamentary process. Now, what happened last week was that the differences over really the value-added tax, because they did take on finally a point that was made from SARS, who said that they could raise a considerable sum of money if they improved and they got more allocation to improve the collection of taxes from people that were evading taxes. There was a bit of money for that, which I think we would welcome. But they then wanted to go ahead with a lower rate of that increase, not 2%, but 0.5% this year and another 0.5% next year. The DA again rejected that, and there was a big impasse between these two coalition party partners. And eventually in the parliamentary committee, there was a proposal that came from some of the smaller parties which said, well, let's pass the fiscal framework as it stands, and then we will ask the Minister of Finance to come back with a progressive tax alternative to the VAT. That was the resolution. And I think we're waiting to see where that's all going. I think we are concerned that if you want players in the financial sector, my own bank for example, are now thinking that this 0.5% VAT increase is a done deal and it's coming in. And they're telling their customers this is what's happening, it's a done deal. In other words, that the promise that the minister would come back with a progressive tax alternative is they don't think this is going to happen. And I think that we are, as a party, we are wanting to say that we want to insist that this does happen. First of all, because what do we mean by progressive alternative? We mean a tax alternative that's going to tax the rich more than the poor. The problem with value-added tax is it's the same rate on all the products that are covered, and for poor people it's a larger percentage of their income than it is for richer people. And there's no end of alternatives that have been put on the table. They would include that we have a differential rate of VAT, we have a higher rate of VAT on luxury goods over a certain high value. There's a higher rate of tax on those. Could also be an excise tax or other kinds of taxes. There could be taxes, we could raise the corporate tax rate to what it used to be. We could have a wealth tax. We could have a tax on financial transactions. All of these things have been proposed by a number of progressive economists, and we say that it's important to go for one of those. It could also be politically important because, unfortunately, our alliance partner, the ANC, has got itself in a position, has found itself in a position where I think the perception of the public out there is that the ANC is wanting to impose taxes on poor people, and the DA is defending poor people against those taxes. Now, I think it's, as I said earlier, it's really nothing of the kind, because the DA wants to cut services much more drastically. And the ANC has a historic opportunity to turn that round now. If the Minister of Finance does come back and does embrace a progressive tax alternative, then the DA's opposition is going to be seen for what it is. It's not an opposition to a regressive tax like that. It's an opposition to any tax, even one imposed on the rich, to finance services for poorer people. And I think they would be shown up for who they are, the champions of the rich and the prosperous, and not defenders of the poor. It may have implications for this coalition government. The experience of last week was that the ANC managed to cobble together enough votes from some of the smaller parties to get this budget proposal over the line. And I think, frankly, we have often said as the party that we did not support this coalition, and it included the DA, and that if it leads to a reconfiguration of government and a reconfiguration that potentially allows a more progressive policy framework across the board, we would welcome that. So I think, in a nutshell, those are the major points about this budget and the way that we see it as the party. So we are calling for no VAT. We are calling for there to be a progressive alternative to raise revenue. But more than that, I think we remain critical of austerity, even the austerity that remains in this budget as it stands. For example, public employment programs are still very, very underfunded, and I think there is still too much of a expectation that by working with profit-seeking capital that we are going to get R1 trillion of investments in infrastructure. We don't think that is the case. This is the thinking that comes in from the so-called Wall Street consensus, where what you do is you de-risk. You go to private capital and you say to them, we want you to invest in infrastructure, water, whatever it may be, and we are going to guarantee you that you're going to get the same rate of return as if you were involved in financial speculation. The only way you can do that is either by allowing them to draw huge subsidies from government, or alternatively, you're going to allow them to structure their services so they target the high-income people, and there's no provision of services to low-income people. And if you don't do that on a sufficient scale, the experience around the world is you're going to be disappointed. In other words, it's a high-cost and low-yield option, which I think has been shown to be the case in many, many jurisdictions around the world, leading many people who supported this blended finance thing to now say that this model is not working, and this de-risking thing is not working, and we need alternatives, which would have to include a greater role for development finance institutions and public finance entities to come into this space. So I think those are the sort of issues and challenges that we face. We do think that we need a big infrastructure push. It's also imperative at the moment, as we face this threat from the United States to levy really punitive tariffs on our exports to the United States, which could lead to big threats to a number of our manufacturing industries, the auto sector, agro-processing sectors and others. We think that there's a need for a much more substantive and ambitious industrial policy that also needs to be properly funded. So we don't think that this is the moment for austerity. This is the moment for government to step up to the plate and to be leading a real economic recovery program whose key metrics are how much have we reduced unemployment, how much have we reduced poverty, and how much have we reduced inequality, not what are the financial ratios. Of course, we can reduce the debt to GDP ratio by growing the economy. That would reduce the ratio anyway. It doesn't have to be always by cutting the debt. It can also be by growing the economy.
Touching on growing the economy, there's always been this issue that the economy hasn't really been growing in the previous years, and that is one of the problems that we've been having. What mechanisms or what can we do to ensure that there is growth in the economy? Because as highlighted, consequences of such as where we are facing being force-fed these austerity measures as if there's no other way than to implement those to rescue the economy.
So the first thing is that the austerity measures are being driven by interest groups. They're not just being implemented because people don't know better. They're being implemented because finance capital, which wants access into international markets, particularly in the United States and the systems and structures in the United States, these ratios are important to its partners. And the point about that is that the South African economy has become extensively financialized over decades, and this is reflected only partially in the fact that in 1994 the percentage contribution to the gross domestic product of financial services was 6%, and it's currently nearly a quarter, nearly 25%. We are one of several countries around the world which underwent extensive financialization. The United States was another, the UK was another, and in all of those cases that went along with deindustrialization. So industrial capacity, productive capacity went down. Financialization also affected the performance of non-financial companies. Perhaps the best example around the world is that of Boeing, which over some years prioritized financial engineering, the share price over aircraft engineering, and it lost out in the competitiveness to Airbus, which did it less, and now to China. And so deindustrialization has been the other side of this. And I think that what we need is we need to really learn the lessons of those countries that have gone from being poor to rich or from underdeveloped to developed. All of them have increased the value addition of their productive sectors. They have industrialized and they've moved away from dependence on exports of raw materials and imports of finished goods into the space of actually manufacturing. That's what China did over some 30, 40 years. And it lifted hundreds of millions of its people out of poverty. But it requires industrial policy, and it requires that resources are directed and invested in productive sectors and in catalytic activities like infrastructure development. Now, according to one estimate, the funds in South Africa, which are now the biggest businesses, some of it is in the banks, but some of it is in wealth managers, as they call themselves, and things like that. All that industry, as they call themselves, they have assets that they are managing, which are something like 3 times the GDP of South Africa. It's not that it's not being invested. If it's not invested, it's not capital. It's being invested, it's just not being invested in the productive sectors in South Africa. That's the point. And we think that these ideas of, trying to de-risk and encourage and offer them all sorts of incentives is not working. And what we need is to be governing the market and leading. And we need to be turning around and saying that we will expect that a certain percentage of your funds is invested in infrastructure, productive activities in the country. Directed investments, prescribed investments, you can call it whatever you like, you can call it something much more mild, but that there will be some requirement and some direction that they're not going to be investing much more in property assets in the United States than they invest in the productive sector in South Africa, which is probably the case right now.
So when we talk about the neoliberal fiscal policies, the budget cuts, what are the practical implications that are faced by the people regarding this route that our government seems stuck on?
Well, I think the first thing is that it means that important services for people are underfunded, and sometimes it's disguised underfunding. So the level of the social relief of distress grant wasn't cut, and it's been slightly increased, but it's not at the level of inflation. But as a recent court case that the Institute of Economic Justice instituted showed, and as a ruling by the court demonstrated and upheld, what they did was they mounted up the bureaucratic procedures for people to access this grant and cut the numbers who were accessing it. So you've had a less effective income support for the poorest in our country. That's the one side. The second side is that it's had a depressing effect on the economy. Not that just any kind of spending would lead to inclusive growth. We also have to address all of the structural issues and the structural transformation that I've been talking about. Instead of which we want to go into what's called structural reform, which is effectively what we're not going to do is directly sell the public utilities that have run these things. Now, Eskom is not up for sale in the market, but you liberalize the sector and you reduce the space for the public sector, and you hope that these private sector people are going to come in. And the next target appears to be water. Now, the UK has gone through that. And what they do is they stop investing in the treatment plants, so the water quality declines to such an extent that even a really conservative Labour government under Keir Starmer is now talking about taking that back into public ownership. I think those are the sort of challenges and issues that we face. But the other thing is that this neoliberalism extends into other spaces as well. It's affected a whole series of supposed free trade rules. It's affected a whole series of industrial policy tools which have been progressively reduced in terms of their legal ability as a result of international trade rules and others. Well, we're living in a different era. I mean, the United States, European Union as well, have been discarding these rules and disregarding them for some considerable time. The most dramatic case is these tariffs that were introduced by President Trump the other day, the so-called reciprocal tariffs. They are in clear violation of the US's so-called bindings at the World Trade Organization. And they are calculated on a completely different basis to any of the legal procedures. So I think that we need to recognize that what we need to do is we need to use policy tools like localization, local content requirements. We need to impose levies on, if we're not going to get any international funding for adaptation, climate change adaptation, and yet we face every year floods and potentially also rising sea levels and droughts, and there's no money for that, and we could actually, considerably alleviate the impact on communities and also on infrastructure if we had public employment programs to deal with that. Why can't we impose levies like the European Union wants to impose when they say our levels of carbon are too high in some of the products that we supply to them? And then beneficiation. Some developing countries have actually realized that this beneficiation space is much more open. And Indonesia, for example, has imposed export taxes and it's got a 30-fold increase in the value of that is in the Indonesian economy from the nickel value chain. We need to use these things much more ambitiously than we've done before. Actually, if we don't, I think we're going to face a huge shock to our economy as a result of these latest US tariffs. They're going to cut out some of our industries in terms of their exports to the North America. But there is an alternative, and that is to work with our neighbours to build regional value chains and to develop the African Continental Free Trade Area into an area where we have much more inclusive and much higher levels of industrialization.
I just want to touch on the zero-rated extended food basket that has been presented as a cushion or a buffer to the vulnerable sections of society in terms of this impending value-added tax. Is it practically cushioning, or is it necessarily making it the government seem as if they are thinking for the poor and the working class, when in fact we don't have control of the market forces beyond the smoke screen of the zero-rated?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that the question of the scale comes up. That the scale of the increase in the zero ratings, even according to the Treasury's own calculations, was about, I think it was 2 billion rand of revenue lost as a result of the zero rating. And then they wanted to raise close to 60 billion from the 2% VAT. So if we say now it's 0.5%, and the figures are there, it's 15 billion versus 2 billion. So the scales are disproportionate. So what you gain from the zero rating as a poor person, you're going to lose more from the increase in VAT. That's the first thing. The second thing is that many of the products are parts of value chains. So the final product may be zero rated, but many of the inputs will not be zero rated. And so the price, the final price, will not reflect the full zero rating. And the third thing is, how is this all going to be controlled? I think there's been some concerns that even the existing zero ratings are not necessarily implemented by all the supermarkets and everyone. So I think those are all the levels. So the zero rating is better than not having it, but it's not going to compensate for an increase in VAT.
An argument has also been placed on the items put on the zero-rated extended basket. The fact that the types of foods that are there are not necessarily the healthiest food for people. They contribute a lot to the health illnesses, and it's pushing the working class again to an unhealthy food alternative in that food.
Yeah, well, maybe there's that aspect as well. I haven't looked at that very closely, but I do know that it is the case. It is true that many of the foods that are consumed by low-income people are foods that are full of salt and full of sugar and stuff like that, and also that many of the sort of processed meat and fish products are really close to pet food in terms of the nutrient value, and in fact it is the case, for example, with these Agoa chickens, that the alternative for some of the things which they do export, what the industry calls the spare parts, the bits and pieces that are not saleable in their own markets, which they're trying to force down our throats. The alternative is to turn it into pet food, and they get less money for it. That's just why they come and twist our arms. So I do think there is that issue as well. But I don't know enough about the details of the items that have been zero rated to be able to say definitively whether that is the case in those items or not.
Okay. I just want to touch on the reliance of our government on VAT. The fact that if we are able to trace from all the years the increase that has been accumulating, and the fact that VAT in itself affects South Africa being a highly unequal society, and relying on VAT in itself exacerbates such economic inequalities as well. What is it that the SACP is presenting perhaps to the government as to say this is an alternative, and VAT is definitely a regressive tax, and this is what should be done?
So the thing about VAT is that why do they like VAT as government authorities? They say it's easy to administer. It's easier to administer than other taxes. And so you've already got a network of VAT in, you just adjust the rate, and supposedly it's easier to administer. That's why they like it. But it is regressive. As I said before, what happens is it's the same rate if you go to a shop and you pay 15.5% on whatever product it is, whether you're rich or poor, you pay the same. And if you are rich, you are paying a much smaller part of your income on it than if you are poor. And I think that's the issue. That's why it's called regressive, because a larger percentage of the tax falls on the shoulders of the poorer than on the rich. Now, progressive taxes, income tax, for example, is a progressive tax. Doesn't mean progressive in the sense of socialist or anything like that, but merely that if you earn above, on the tax tables, you earn above a certain amount, the rate increases. So you might be charged 20% at the lowest bracket. By the time you get to the top, you charge 45% on that part of your income. So I think that's the difference. And so what we've called for is for progressive taxes in that sense of the term. That if you've got a revenue need, you should be going and charging the rich. And by the way, there is a very great disproportion between the ability of the rich and the poor to escape taxes. We've got a very substantial, I think SARS said that they say they could collect 80 billion rand. No, sorry, it was more than that. It was significant. I think it was 800 billion. If they were properly invested in anti-tax avoidance and tax evasion measures. And a lot of this is because corporates are engaged in what is called base erosion and profit shifting. So you do a lot of intercompany transactions. You send the final load to a tax haven somewhere, and you avoid paying tax along the way. You've got some absolutely bizarre examples around the world where, quite significant chains pay almost no tax in some jurisdictions when it's very well known that they're making tons and tons of money there. And then the other one is that richer people have got all kinds of tax advisors and tax consultants that are actually able to get out of all sorts of things that ordinary poorer people don't get out of. So I think those are the imbalances and the inequities. So there is a bit of an attempt now, which I think we welcome, to try to close some of these tax loopholes. But actually, it was said that was going to happen in the recovery program after COVID, and it didn't happen. It hasn't happened. And so there's been no end of studies that have said there are big illicit capital flows out of Africa, that illicit capital leaving the African continent as a whole, including South Africa, is equivalent to the size of the foreign direct investment and the official development assistance combined. And I was involved in the reviewing a book which came out and was looking at South Africa, and it said the biggest source of it was not from corruption payments, although they were significant. The biggest source was from misinvoicing of mineral export sales. And so I think these are the sort of challenges that we've got. So what we're calling for is we're calling for greater equity in terms of paying for taxes and in the terms of the levying of taxes.
We are approaching May Day. We're speaking about the budget, which will most likely affect the workers, the unemployed, the poor. What is the message to our people, to the class, to the vulnerable section of society around the hostility or the harshness or the unfavorable economic conditions that we find ourselves?
Well, I think for a start on the budget itself, we will probably call from the Central Committee meeting, we will call for there to be for the government to honour the point that was made in the resolution, which is to come back with a progressive alternative to VAT and also to bracket creep, which we haven't talked about, but the idea that you allow inflation to take over and people go into a higher tax bracket as a result of inflation, not because of increased earnings. But the point is that we would hope that would happen, and I think that if that does happen, we can then go to working people and poor and say there's a victory, that we've got a progressive alternative instead of that. If they don't honour that and they stick to that, then I think we have to say that we are not happy with that. We are criticising that. I think we have to say that we recognise that there's been some small change to the continuous cutting which has characterised budgets in the last several years. But we remain concerned that we are still in maybe a slightly lesser austerity than we've had before, but still austerity, and that we are not investing sufficiently in the public infrastructure program. We don't believe it's going to come from private sector profit-seeking players. It's not going to solve the problems of infrastructure development that we need, and that we are now facing additional challenges from the global environment, from the tariffs that have been imposed by the United States, from the possibility that there will be a recession in the world economy, that there will be all kinds of turbulence and uncertainty, and that the only way forward is that we need a higher level and much more ambitious industrial policy that takes advantage of the new policy space that's been created and of the fact that we're now in a relationship with the rest of the continent through the African Continental Free Trade Area. I think those are the kind of messages that we need to be setting out to our people, and we need to struggle for this, and we need to struggle for this against the vested interests of rich people who benefit from the existing financialization and who want to tie us down to a series of policies which are blatantly not leading to any reduction on any significant scale of poverty, inequality and unemployment.
Thank you very much, Comrade Rob Davies, for taking your time and unpacking all that analysis regard to the budget, the VAT and the economic climate that you are facing. Thank you to all the viewers and listeners out there. Please do tune in next time. We will announce our next episode. Do like and follow our pages on YouTube and Facebook and on X platform. Our name is the Red Mic podcast under the South African Communist Party. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.